Well, for those of you who may not know who I am, I'm the Reverend Dr. Mark Jefferson, the Assistant Professor of Homiletics here. I am also the Acting Director of Deep Calls to Deep this year, while my colleague Dr. Ruth Anna Hook is on sabbatical. And so I'm grateful for her leadership for this program to be able to be what it is because she's labored so diligently to make sure that you all are here today. So in her absence, I welcome you. What we have today, we have a special treat. We have a bishop who loves preaching. And it's also a treat to have a bishop who can preach. Did I say something wrong? Oh, I'm just saying. So the Right Reverend Bishop Mariann Budde, she is a scholar, an author. She is also the leader of the Diocese of Washington. She is the first woman elected to the position. So she's not only the leader of all the churches in her diocese, but she also is responsible for leading the schools and the cathedral as well. So the National Cathedral, the see, that is her jurisdiction. So we have someone who understands preaching, who knows preachers the world over, and has lent her expertise to us tonight. I admire her because she's not only digging her roots deep in the Episcopal world, but she wants to revitalize preaching throughout the Christian tradition. So she reaches across denominations, Baptist, evangelical. She wants to bring out the best in Christian preaching. And so we have been honored tonight to have one of God's great preachers and one of God's great leaders. Hey, you shouldn't have been great. If you weren't great, I wouldn't have said it. So if you would put your hands together for the Right Reverend Bishop Mariann Budde.
Well, I do feel like I'm in church because there's a whole bunch of empty seats in the front. Seriously, if any of you in the back would like to have a comfortable chair and a table, you are welcome to come forward. I'd like to begin with a passage from 2 Corinthians, one you all well know. Therefore, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart. We have renounced the shameful things that one hides. We refuse to practice cunning or to falsify God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we commend ourselves to the conscience of everyone in the sight of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God, does not come from us. So, I welcome you to the fellowship of clay jars. Really honored to be back. This is my third occasion to be present with Deep Calls to Deep, and it's a great honor. And I so admire the faculty and staff and the colleagues that circle around the orbit of Virginia Seminary and its commitment to preaching. I'm going to give you everything I've got tonight, so take what's helpful, leave the rest. If you've heard this presentation before, there may be some repeat material, but I figure if it was worth hearing once, it might be worth hearing again. And if I have an original idea, I'll tell you, but most of my ideas, like most of yours, come from somewhere, and they don't usually originate with me. Preaching in full presence is the title of my talk tonight, and I'm borrowing the phrase full presence from the poet David White. He He begins a piece about the process of writing poetry with this line: "The body in full presence holds its first creative essence in the pen that touches paper." Yeah, the body in full presence holds its first creative essence in the pen that touches paper, or the fingers that touch the keyboard. And my premise is, of course, that preaching in full presence, to whatever degree we are graced by that capacity, begins long before we're standing before a congregation offering a sermon. It begins with the process of preparation, which is often lonely and essential work of showing up to that pen touching paper or the keyboard. And before that, in the reflection and artistic process from which the ideas of a sermon are born, or is born, the thoughts that come to us in the early morning, the books we happen to be reading, the conversations we're having, the fruit of our daily prayers, all caught up in this interpretive process, incarnational interpretive process that culminates, God willing, on Sunday morning with a sermon. Right, now that all sounds really lovely, I know, but let me also be real about the context in which we do our work. Because I've been preaching for 30 years now, and for most of those years, including this one, I'm preaching in front of a congregation, if not once, usually twice, sometimes 3 times a week. And some of those sermons I'm actually pleased with, in the sense that I feel like I've offered my best, the best I had to give, and it seemed to have been well received. And some people told me afterwards that it was even helpful to them in some way, or they felt that I was speaking to them. Now, many of my sermons fall short of that standard. And I've had to make my peace with that over time, that I'm not always going to hit the ball when I'm up at bat. And if I get too hung up about that, I'm going to freeze the next time I'm up at bat, or I'm in the pulpit, or standing before a group. So there is an inherent humility that comes with the preaching endeavor. And I just think we have to accept that, right? I think it was Richard Rohr who said, you know, he has enough notoriety now that he prays for one humiliation a day. And it's the one prayer, he says, that God always seems pleased to answer. And I feel that way about preaching. Just when I think I can believe all that stuff that Mark said about me, right, I totally bomb. And sometimes on Christmas Eve at the cathedral. So, you know, you just don't know when it's not gonna happen. But that's because we're standing in a space that's not safe, right? It's not guaranteed. And yet it comes, and we're there. And we do it not because we want to or we're particularly inspired, but because it's our job. And the people are expecting a word. So, like you, I know the importance of good preaching for building up the body of Christ and for the growth of the church. It's always noted as one of the top, most important qualities for those who are looking for a spiritual home or those who feel fed by their faith community. And while I was parish priest for 23 years, 18 of them as rector, and I learned that it is that important. But I also learned that as essential as it is, it's only one critical component of a healthy church, right? So it's worthy of every moment we can squirrel away to prepare for our sermons. If we focus on preaching alone, it's not going to build the church. It has to be one component of a series of pastoral and ministerial qualities that lead to health and excellence in community. So that means those of us, particularly those of you who are called, as I was, as a solo pastor for years, you just got to be good at a lot of things all the time, which means you're not going to be good at everything all the time. And those are constant judgment calls. And the thing I believe, and I do believe this with all my heart, is that God knows this about what we're being asked to do. Now, Mark mentioned that I study other traditions, and I do, and several traditions have actually figured it out that it's probably good to have a bit of separation of labor. And so some traditions have a senior pastor who does most of the preaching and the teaching, and something called an executive pastor that does all the things that you and I would give our eye teeth to have somebody else do, right? But that's not how it works for most of us. So we kind of have to make do and surround ourselves with people who can complement our gifts while we take essential responsibility for the overall tone of a place. Amen? Amen. All right. So I'm a student of preaching like you, and I see it as a function, one essential function of spiritual leadership. And I value the example of good preachers, and I try to learn from them. And because it is the spiritual practice that I have no choice but attending to every week, it is the discipline that has become and remains the arena for much of my own growth as a follower of Jesus. You know, I often say that for preachers, the miracle of the loaves and the fish is a weekly event, right? We offer what we have, right? No, seriously. It's like, do you believe in the loaves and the... Absolutely. Happens every week. Now, it's not always, you know, there's not always 12 baskets left over, but amazingly so. What we offer is honored by the grace of God. And I just want us to bring as much of ourselves, our true selves, our full presence into this endeavor, because it is an extraordinary privilege as well as a responsibility. Who else in the community gets 15 minutes of uninterrupted speech, right? In the context of prayer, wearing fancy clothes, right? No one. So it's an important, and so it's also important that we show up in that role fully ourselves. Not in a different tone of voice than the tone of voice that we speak to in conversation. Not with an affect that is our preaching affect, although in some traditions they do that to great effect. It's just not something that I could ever do. It's like I said, you may hear different things from different people, but that's how it is for me. And I can tell, and that's one of the reasons why I want to show you a video in a moment, because I can tell when I'm not fully present. Can you? Yeah. And I want you to think about that. How do you know when you're not fully present, right? Just think about that for a moment. I'll share with you when I know after a while. But it's a fascinating thing to be in your own body and realize you're not all there because of anxiety or lack of sleep or fill in the blank, right? So how can we be present to the process and present to the moment? Okay, so I'm going to pause here and ask you a question, and I'd like you to write this down or just think about it for yourself, and then I'm going to ask some of you who feel willing to share, and my understanding is that microphones would be helpful for this part, so if you're willing to share, Anna and Deirdre are going to pass around microphones, so just think about it. But here's the question. For you, and perhaps your colleagues, how do you assess the quality of your preaching? On what specific criteria? How do you evaluate the ones that you're proud of to the ones you hope no one has recorded and posted online? Right. Or to ask the same question another way, what do you hope your sermon accomplishes? Okay, so I'll just give you a moment to think about that. And if you have an answer that you're willing to share, I'd like you to just raise your hand and maybe say your name and where you serve, just so we can become community together.
So my name's Marjorie, and I pastor in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I have a power of 3 reality. I talk about Trinity all the time to my people. And I have 3 people in my congregation. One of them's my former warden. One of them's my choir director who has read the Bible 24 times over with his Baptist family. And one is the soloist in my choir. And they are just deep theological people. And so if I get a text from Christine, or I get pulled aside by it's always on the same day for some reason. Those 3 people will either text me or tell me that my sermon meant something to them, and it doesn't happen all the time. And when it does, I just treasure it. It happened like 3 weeks ago, and I just went home like,
You're walking on air.
So it's just that, but it's those 3, and it's because I know they have an intense spirituality, and they listen, and a lot of my stuff is old. So when I bring something new to them that they haven't heard.
Thank you. Others? Anyone else willing to share? What for you is a satisfactory, I did a good job sermon?
I'm Fran Gardner-Smith, and I'm the rector at St. Thomas in McLean. And it was interesting that you used the baseball metaphor. Like sometimes you go up to the plate. I'm a baseball fan. And you know that like when somebody hits a home run, they know it, right?
Yeah.
Like they're like the sound that the bat and the ball make. Like I have people in my congregation that I kind of watch because some people are like, so then you know you're off, right? But when all the pieces come together, I know it.
Yeah.
Like I know it in my bones that I worked this one all the way through, and it's going out of the park, and I know it. Now sometimes I think I struck. And somebody else will say, that sermon really spoke to me. Great, I'm so glad. But the ones that go, there's just a feeling in my bones that it went.
I hear you. Thank you. A couple more. The gentleman in back.
And Peter Ackerman, rector of St. Christopher's in Springfield, Virginia, of course.
Of course.
I forgot. For me, it might dovetail with Fran's, but it's a different way of sensing that. And it's when the congregation to whom I'm preaching, they, as a whole, are still. There's not coughing, there's not rattling of
Right.
bulletins, and especially at the parts where I'm delivering the nugget, the good news, whatever you want to call
Right.
it. And this probably goes back, I was in another lifetime, I was trained to be a stage actor, so I learned how to understand an audience and read an audience and know when an audience is paying attention.
Right.
I don't see my congregation as an audience per se. However, when it is theater, I mean, we do, it is theater, but it's different. I never tell my congregation about, oh yeah, I was once an actor, and because then they say, oh, well, you're so good in front of people, it must be that acting you're doing, and I'm like, well, no, I'm not acting. But from the gift of my past is I do get a sense of when, and to Fran's point, when I've somehow hit it because they are still, and when they are still at the time when I really want them to be receiving what I'm giving, I know that the Holy Spirit, my words, whatever it is, has worked to make that happen.
Right.
So,
Thank you
thanks.
for that. I want to, did you want to say something? A couple more? Well, briefly, a couple more, and then we need to move on.
I will be brief.
Okay.
I'm Linda, and I serve as interim rector of Christ Church West River, the second other diocese. You mentioned in the beginning about the preaching venue or the preaching context being a way for your own spiritual growth.
Yeah.
And when I was here at VTS many, many years ago, our homiletics professor used to say, your sermon is the one you preach to yourself.
Yeah.
And so when I know that in my heart of hearts, and I feel that the congregation as well, it's a growth for us, then I think that's one of the criteria.
Thank you. Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. And I just think it's really important for each of us to know what that is for us, which does not discount what several of you alluded to, which is what the Holy Spirit can do with a half-baked sermon, right? Or a sermon that for whatever reason, even if we spend all, 40 hours that week working on it, and it still doesn't we offer it anyway, and sometimes that can have the most transformational quality, right? So all of that mystery included, to simply acknowledge that it's really nice to know what it feels like inside when that spiritual power is, as Paul said, and I have enough, people-pleasing needs and insecurities and ego and all that. So I bring all of that into the pulpit. I do. And I try to offer that up too, because I figure, well, it's part of the clay pot, right? Here I am, Lord. But you often feel carried even beyond that, right? And it's such a great thing. Thank you for mentioning acting. I'm going to show a video now of a master class, a clip of a master class from Patsy Rodenberg, who is a very well-regarded Shakespearean acting coach. And she talks about circles of energy. And so some of you have seen this. My son, the theater major, introduced this to me probably, well, he was a freshman, so that's probably 10 years ago now. And he just said, "Mom, I think this might be helpful for you in your work." And actually, I'm a great lover of theater, and I think one of the gifts of theater is that in a role you have to be fully present, right? It's calling forth from you while at the same time allowing others to project onto you, right? So, with no further ado, this is about a 10-minute clip from Patsy Rodenberg.
So I wanted to tell that story. So we'll talk about the second circle. About 30 years ago, when I started to teach, I became very upset with a lot of the teachers I worked with, because they would say things to me like, "Oh, he's got it, she hasn't." And that upset me because, as I said, I'm stubborn, and I was also taught with a lot of cruelty, so I don't like cruelty. It's funny that, isn't it? At the centre of every Shakespeare play is a central message that we must not misuse our power. And I've seen more people doing Shakespeare misuse their power over others. Now that's interesting. I'm getting controversial, aren't I? Any case, I was doing this work, and I started to think, well, I actually can see that person has got it, and that person has it sometimes, and then they don't have it. And at the same time as teaching in drama schools and professional actors, I was teaching in 2 top security prisons. And what was very clear to me is that every prisoner I was teaching had it. Because in order to survive in the prison, they had to be present. They might have got very good at hiding it, but you never saw one of them relax. In fact, some of them said to me, "We can never sleep because we're always having to be present." So as I developed this work, I started to believe that we had 3 circles of energy, that we worked within 3 circles of energy. Now let's get this very clear. We need all 3. We can move very rapidly between the 3. We can be very good physically in a circle and not very good in another way. If I divide us into, the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, and the spiritual. But a great performer is in one circle all the time, and that's called the second circle. But this is what I discovered, and I'm going to start doing this work, and eventually I'm going to ask some of you to do it with me, if that's all right. Is that terrible? I won't pounce on anyone, I'm not going to do that awful. First circle energy is energy that falls back into you, often in the body. And I'm going to talk about the body, the breath, the voice, the ability to hear, listen, the ability to feel, the ability to think. in these circles. But first circle, here we go. And actually, it goes into the voice. You can say anything to anybody in first circle because the voice falls back. You can say, do you know, I really love you. Because actually, first circle is to yourself. It's absolutely to yourself. It's of the past. Does that make any sense? It's of the past. You know, we know we're in for not a very interesting evening in the theatre. I actually don't know how actors rehearse on the rehearsal room floor in first circle, but a lot of them do. You know? It's inwards. It's connected in there. I'm going to go into second in a moment, but on the other side of second circle is third circle. Are you following this? Do you want to talk to me? You'll tell me if it doesn't make any sense, won't you? Talk to me. Yes. Yes. On the other side of first circle is third. This is generalized energy that's pushed out. The people who take your space. Do you know those people? Takes the oxygen out of the room. It's often in the body, the chest is up. Voices that are too loud. Have you noticed how so many Shakespeare productions, they're just all in third? Shouting at each other. My liege! The horse awaits! A third circle, though, is very dangerous because it seems like it's energized, you know? The energy's going out. It's of the future. Does that make any sense? You're pushing out. It's very controlling. We sometimes need third circle energy. We sometimes need first circle energy. But this amazing thing of being present, which is an exchange of energy between two people, that the focus is absolutely on something. It could be a human being. It could be playing with a toy. It could be listening to music. It could be reading a book in second circle, so you're connected to it and it's connected to you. It's the give and the take of being present. And by the way, we are born in second circle. We're born there. Every child comes onto the planet alert. It is the circle of survival. You cannot survive unless you come into second circle. Is that right? I mean, that's why when you're drunk, it's very hard to survive. I say that because I had a very interesting experience with the Kalahari Bushmen. That came off the wall, didn't it? If you ever walk through the bush, you're in second circle. And by the way, I think the nature of Shakespeare heightened is that they're all in second circle. I mean, I'm too old to be rigid. You know, I actually, when I did Richard II with Ralph Fiennes, we decided that he didn't have to be in second until he realizes he's under threat. Because actually, I'll talk about first circle a bit more, but are you with me? So the Kalahari Bushmen, I just, because there's me and I ask questions. And I said, does a lion ever get you lot? Because actually, if you go into the bush, you hear stories of, tourists being eaten, And he just looked at me and he said, only when we're drunk. So, second circle, survival. It is the circle of energy of absolute intimacy. You cannot be intimate. I always say this is very trivial. Sorry, I go from the profound to the absolute trivial. If you want to seduce somebody, take them out to a restaurant and be in second circle with them. Just be with them. Here we go, all over the planet. You talk about Shakespeare, and the first line people say to you is, to be or not to be? That is the question. And actually, that is the question that I'm asking and that I'm actually writing about in the second circle. Are we present or not? Hamlet could just have another gin and tonic and not face... Do you know? The choice in life to come back to our presence. Of course, life is going to batter it out of us. It batters it out of children. I remember teaching in very tough schools, and a child would go away for the weekend, absolutely present, and come back the next Monday, and you'd lost something of them, you know? To be in second circle is this continual sense of being present. And if we lose it, knowing how to come back. Actors over the weekend said to me, well, you know, when I go for an audition, everybody on the panel is in first circle. Is that right? Well, not always. But it's a choice, isn't it? It's a choice not to bully them into third because it doesn't work. Third circle doesn't work. It's got a superficial energy. But to stay present. It is the circle of equality. Once we're in second circle together, we are equal. Some people don't want to go into second circle because they feel the victimhood of first. Yes? Or the controlling superiority of third. Now, I think we're losing this. I think that as we lose it, as a community, as a society, we get lonelier and lonelier. Do you know that sad picture in restaurants with a couple sitting there, both in first? How many people have said to me, I'm in a room with somebody and alone? To continually connect back to our presence.
I don't want to jump to how we are in the pulpit just yet, or however it is you preach from the steps or on the platform, where the images of first, second, and third are so powerful. Because I want to get there. And that's where I was asking you before about when you could tell. Because that's an interesting, can you tell when you're, to use her language, in first, second, or third? But I want to back up and think about what it's like to show up, as she was describing, like showing up to a book or showing up to listening to music. How do we show up as present as we can be to the process of preaching, to the life of a preacher? Because if you preach with any regularity, you know that it's the process that culminates in one sermon, and then you take a nap, and you're on to the next, right? Beyond the mountain, as the Haitians say, lies another mountain. So it really doesn't matter on Thursday if last Sunday's sermon was great, right? Doesn't matter, because you know what I'm saying? So it's just that, so it's the continual life. And I want to explore with you, and I trust I'm speaking to colleagues, about what it feels like to show up fully present to this preaching or writing or creative process of any kind. Because I discovered early on in my work as a parish priest that preaching wasn't at its best one more task in a long list of things I needed to do in a given week, although it often felt that way, especially in the beginning. But it really had the power to integrate a lot of pieces of life and leadership. Some of you mentioned talking about your own inner work, right? Your own sense of what's going on in a community, needing to factor in what's happening in the wider society and in our world, obviously engaging the text in some significant way, that there's your own life, right? I mean, which doesn't mean it all shows up in the sermon, for God's sake. I mean, there are boundaries and all, but just the idea of showing up for all of it in the process. And I know Lisa Cressman is going to be here later in the week, and she would tell us all, and I believe this, that the farther back we can go in the preparation process, the more time we give to the creative work. I am working toward a life. don't have it yet, where I'm several weeks out as I'm working on sermons. For some preachers, that's just normal. That was never my rhythm. And I am moving in that direction more and more. And I am becoming increasingly impressed with the power of thematic sermons, where you take something and you dwell on it over time. And so you allow, first of all, you build anticipation and people, and it starts to connect to other formation opportunities in the church, just to have some sense that it's not just hit or miss every week what the themes are going to be, but you've actually thought about that. Again, I don't do this all the time. I'm in a different church every Sunday, so that complicates things a bit, but I've done it, and it's actually helped me in my own work to look at a season and think about the themes that I want to explore in that season. I took a page out of Michael Curry's Way of Love this year, and we actually invited people in the diocese. We created an alternative lectionary, and we just created a lectionary for each of the 7 practices in the Way of Love, and allowed people to preach on that spiritual life. And the feedback was amazing. I mean, it was fun for the preachers, but it was also really uplifting for the congregations. And so I just encourage us to think as creatively as we can about how we show up for the process. And I think the lectionary is a tool, but it's one tool. And I think the presiding bishop is giving us all a lot of permission to supplement texts with texts, right? Stories that circle back. There's a light touch we can use with the themes that emerge in Scripture as it's given to us in the lectionary. And we have far more creative license, I think, than we realize. And to feel emboldened by that, while honoring the great ebb and flow of the liturgical life, which I love, and I trust you do as well, right? So that's one way. Now that's my ideal. Now my real life is, most weeks that's just not possible. And so I have to, in great humility, practice showing up in full presence when I know darn well my presence isn't going to be enough. Like, I didn't give it enough time. I procrastinated too long. I was working on something that felt really important at the time, and here I am, right? It's not a comfortable place to be, but I'd rather show up fully present to that than fake it, right? And I've been at it long enough that I know what it feels like to fake it, which doesn't mean going back and reusing a theme from a previous sermon is a bad idea, but that's not the same as taking a theme and reworking it as it is to just phoning it in, right? So being honest with God and honest with myself to say, okay, here I am. Sorry, help, and let's go to work, right? And typically, and I don't know how this is for you, but typically at some point there's a switch that goes off, and I get intrigued, right? And sometimes it happens, way too late for it to be a really great sermon, but it might be a good enough sermon, And there's a lot to be said for good enough sermons, particularly if you're, doing daily fare. You're not going to get that great text every week from your greatest fan, right? Because then it'd be like getting an A+ every time you turned in a paper, and, it would be nice, but it's not real. So I also feel like, in this process part, I would encourage us all to, bless you, be willing to follow a new thought, even if you know it's not going to be fully formed by Sunday or whenever you're preaching. It's risky, and it might turn out to be a much better sermon later on, But I think that's the faith part in my journey with God in preaching, is to take the risk of something that feels, and I have to judge it, because if it's too risky, that may not be helpful. It may be for later. But, I think it was Annie Dillard who said, if you're writing, spend it all, don't hold back. And I'm kind of a believer in that in preaching, and be willing to risk that. And then also, and you've been at this long enough to know what this is like, there are those times when you jettison everything at the last minute and start over, right? I don't recommend that as a weekly fare, not for people like me, but it happens. And sometimes it has to, and again, that's the clay jar part of this, right? I didn't share with you what I look for in a sermon, so let me do that right now, and because it's shifted over time, and I would have echoed almost everything that is said, and I still do. But actually, my definition of a sermon now or a good sermon is pretty basic. And it's, was it helpful? Was it helpful to the people who were listening? And helpful in a way that allowed them to trust something of their own relationship with God or their place in the world. Something that gave them something to think about that was really worth their time, that I had spent more time thinking about than they had time to think in the past week because they were doing other jobs. But was it helpful to them? Was it a connection? And in the vein of great theater, did it convey the experience of what I was trying to describe? In other words, if I was preaching about forgiveness, did people feel the power of forgiveness, or the longing for it, or the ache for it, that kind of connection? And so for me, in the process, it's asking to be, with everything that I have to bring to the task from my end, how to be present to God and to life, to the keyboard, to the mess, and trust that something of value, God willing, will result. Okay. I'd like to stop there and ask any of you for reflections, thoughts, anything at all that, just in terms of, now I'm talking about I'm going to shift now to the actual delivery of sermons for the next part, but before we go there, just anything at all, questions or ideas? Yes, ma'am, and Deirdre's coming down with the microphone.
Is that alternate liturgy on your website?
It is, on the Diocese of Washington's website, The Way of Love.
Can be used?
Yeah. With the presiding bishop's blessing, actually. So, yeah. And some of the clergy are doing different things. Like this summer, 2 of our clergy are doing interesting characters in the Bible. Is their sermon series for the summer, which I think is great. Just as a way to make summer interesting, right? So anyway, yeah. I always tell people the answer is always yes, as long as you ask me. Almost always yes, as long as because I want to foster creativity. I'd rather people err on the side of creativity and learn from it than be afraid to try things. So that's one church in our diocese. They never asked me, but I love it anyway. They've been using readings from the Christmas Carol as their second reading every Advent for the last 5 years. And I happened to be in, I was preaching that day, and so in addition to the Advent readings, there was something about Scrooge and whatever spirit he was with. But it was just interesting and creative, and so anyway. Other questions or comments, thoughts about this showing up to the task long before or days before, or hours before we're in speaking. Anyone? What? Yes. Oh, yes, you better.
I find that there's a difference between preaching to my congregation that I see day in and day out, that I live with, and then when I have to preach sort of what I call the head of state events.
Yeah.
And those are different places of being present.
Yep.
And I know you get to do that. And so would you share a little bit about how you find those distinctions and being present in to two really different events?
Yep. Yeah, and preparing for them in that way. It's very different. And I tell you, my first 2 years as a bishop, I was like a fish out of water because I was used to preaching to the same congregation for 18 years, right? And I had a few outside gigs, but man, every Sunday a different place. And so I think it is a different preparation process because you're not in the same kind of conversation that you're with in spiritual community. And you have a reference point that you can draw, and you're trying to create community in your preaching. And I guess what I would say is all of those dynamics are in play, but there's a lot more speculation. And I have to give a lot of thought to who's in the room. What is the context? Adam Hamilton, who's a preacher I really admire, he wrote a book on speaking well, and he said one of the 3 questions he has to ask himself is, why am I here? Like, why am I preaching to this group of people, right? Which I think is a great question, right? Why am I the one? And who are these people, right? And then what might the message be? So whatever you can do, even if it's just getting a sense of the room. Now, I have to admit, I can go way off base when I do that, when my anxiety gets high, and I can start thinking that, oh, well, this is a very important sermon, and where does that put me? Third circle, right? Or I get really shy, right? So the other thing that's helpful to remember, and this was something that a friend of mine said to me when actually I was in the race for bishop, and this was a retired priest in the diocese, and he said, Mariann, I was looking around at a bunch of clergy and the laity and the convention, and he said, you could look at the Diocese of Washington as this very important diocese, right? But when I look around, what I see is a lot of really struggling, anxious, broken people. And if you can remember that, you can be a decent bishop. If you get all caught up in the head of state, right? That can really do a number on your head. And so I think it was again, David White said that he mastered being able to speak to a group of 1,000 as if it were a group of 100 by just focusing on this idea of presence, right? That it's bigger, but it's also the disciplines are the same. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are some of the things that I try to do. Now, it was this year when I walked into the cathedral at 6 o'clock and they said to me, the vice president and his family is coming at 6 and the president is coming at 11. Okay, I look at the text and I think, do I change anything, right? And I tell you, the only lines I changed, I regretted afterwards, right? Yeah. And it was just interesting to just think, okay, And when somebody asked me, said, did you try to look at him when you were preaching? And I said, no. I tried to look in the back of the cathedral and at my mother. Those are the only two people, it's the only ones that matter. But anyway, but it's a great question, and it's a preacher's dilemma. Other thoughts or questions? Keith? Quick, microphone, sorry. And then we're going to move on.
You mentioned about preaching several weeks or preparing several weeks out. What's been hardest? What's been easiest?
The hardest part is just the grind of the schedule that crowd out, the tyranny of everyday urgent life and genuinely urgent life. So what I'm striving for are those, so that's the struggle. And what's helping me, and what I'm actually going to try and do this summer with a longer arc, I'm going to try and, as best I can, spend about a week mapping out the year, which a lot of Protestant preachers do, by the way. I mean, this is like, are you kidding me? You haven't done that? What are you thinking? But, with lectionary-based preachers, we tend to just get in the rhythm of opening up the lectionary on Monday, if we're lucky. Right, yeah. And just to say, okay, so let's just say, what if for 4 weeks I'm gonna play with the idea of vocation, and vocation in different contexts. Or what if I'm gonna play with the idea of, a big theme, forgiveness, or spiritual practice, right? I mean, something that has a broad enough theme that it can cover a lot of bases and it can draw upon a lot of resources. And then you can start gathering like raw material and just sticking it in a proverbial file and begin to think about it. Now, again, talk to me in a year and I'll let you know how it goes. I got through 2 seasons this year, and that I was really proud about that. And then the rest of life just kind of took over. One more question, yes. Deirdre's coming down. Sorry, this is.
I have a friend who's a bishop, and he has a policy. I think it's a good one, but I'm just curious. I haven't done it, but he has what he calls a back pocket sermon. So it's a sermon about, like, his for a time was the Our Father. So that when he had a really crazy week, he could pull out the back pocket sermon. And it was something he does do like several weeks ahead. But what do you think about that? Having like a back pocket sermon?
I think it's a great idea. I don't have one, but I do have 30 years of sermons. Okay. Right? And every once in a while, I'll go back and I'll read what I wrote. And I'll see if any of it, and sometimes if I'm desperate, I will. I'll just, I'll use some of it, right? It's not my best work, although sometimes my best work has been a reworking of an older sermon, So I'm not opposed to that because, how many of you listen to Michael Curry? I listen to him almost all the time. How many sermons does Michael Curry preach? One. Do you ever get tired of hearing it? No. So, now it's not always the same sermon, but he's got, and if you've ever read the sermons of Dr. King, it's the same thing, right? There's this sort of sea in which they swam, and and it was a big sea, right? I mean, they're drawn from a lot of stuff, but the themes, and so I'm less afraid of that. I don't like canned sermons, but I do like having, gosh, we all need a break, right? And we all need a way to engage ideas that have stayed with us over a lifetime. I probably don't have that many sermons, to be honest, And so, but the reworking of themes, what comes back around, So, yeah. Okay, I'd like to move on in the time we have left to the actual giving of a sermon. And this is where I think Patsy Rodenberg's ideas are so helpful. So, what does it feel like to be in first person when you're in the pulpit? Right? Now, for introverts, that can feel kind of comfortable, right? It can be very thoughtful. This is where I think some of doing our own work explicitly from the pulpit can be a little risky because we can become very inward. My rule of thumb is I try to have some sense of resolution about an issue before I preach on it. Now, I'm not quite honoring that rule tomorrow morning. So, just a little foretaste of the sermon tomorrow morning. It's a little raw, but it's what I got. So you got what I got tomorrow. And the theme was just so real. But in general, I like to have just a little bit of emotional distance when I'm preaching about something that has to do, and I have, I don't know if you saw this article. This is such a busted moment for parents. But I don't know if you saw, but like kids, and as they're growing up, are now trying to tell their parents what they can and cannot post about them on social media. You saw that? And I think the same applies to kids in sermons, right? Or husbands, or friends, right? It's sort of like, but there's such great raw material, I mean, it's just like everywhere. So of course you ask permission, you do all those things, but just to be mindful that you're treading on other people's lives, and so to be careful about that. And so, but first circle, the reason I'm going back to that is that this, first circle. It is, first circle is when, for me, a sign of first circle is when on a Sunday morning, people respond to me worried about me. Does that make sense? When people respond to me worried about me, right? Now, some of that is projection. I know that, right? And that's okay. But it's like, are you okay? Or, it's like, uh-oh. That's, right. And also, but for me, I think I'm more tempted in first person in the preparation process than I am in the actual presenting process. I tend to get very panicky and self-pity and all that. I have to work all that out, right? I hate preaching. I never want to preach again. Who thought this was a good idea, right? Just get that all out there, right? And then go to work. Yeah, right. Who thought of this stupid lectionary, right? So just get that. Okay, so, but I think, okay, so that's less sort of predictable terrain in the pulpit as third circle, right? At least for me. Now, I asked you before how you could tell when you're not being present. Here's how I can tell. And by the way, I tape most of my sermons and I listen to them as I'm driving home. Humiliation every day. But part of the reason why is I'm listening for my tone of voice. I'm listening for my tone of voice because I get pretty shrill or I start talking fast. I have a couple of tics that I notice. And I try not to be judgmental about that and, weird about how I sound and everything. But it's just nice to get that immediate feedback of where was I? And then try to think of ways I can be more present the next time. Or I can say, hey, I showed up, Missed a couple of key points there in the second part, but good job, or whatever. But that idea of, so that's what I notice. I notice my presentation becomes not my true self, right? What about some of you? What are some of the ways that you feel, and you don't have to share this, but just to name it for yourself, or if you want to share it, but just how do you know when it's off? And it's nothing to be judgmental about, but just to be aware of, like what, because if we're aware of it, we have more possibility of modulating and self-regulating. Not complete, but far more than when we're not aware, right? So how do you, yes, in the back. Would you be willing to share?
It's embarrassing.
I know, that's right. It's let it all out.
I will. I feel comfortable now.
Yeah.
No, for me, it's that moment when I know that it's when I realize I can see myself saying something and I'm having a second dialogue in the back of my head.
Exactly.
That,
yeah.
oh, good, you do too. Oh, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm crazy, but I'm not alone. It's that moment of not.
Yeah, it's like you're watching yourself.
Yeah. And you're going,
Right.
wow, am I really saying all these things?
Right.
Is this really coming
Right.
out now? Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of really bad self-referential jokes are third-person energy in the pulpit, right? Or throwaway lines. that are going to please the crowd, but I guarantee you offend somebody, and you're going to wish to God you didn't say it. At least I'm speaking for myself now. Or that introduction that was really all about you and not about your process. Boy, was this a tough week for, all of that. And again, no, we're friends, right? I mean, I do all these things, but it's third circle energy. It's energy that's projected out. And it gets people thinking about us, but in a different sort of way. And it raises the anxiety in the room. So one of the things I think a lot about is what can I do to lower my anxiety, or at least ask God to hold it for me so that I can focus on what I have to offer that might be really important for someone to hear. Maybe not, but it might be. And what can I do? A really good joke will do that. If you're funny, I'm not particularly, but every once in a while, people are kind and they laugh, and it's almost like they want to laugh, right? They just want to laugh. A good story will do that, particularly if it has a point and it has something to do with your sermon. Those are really good things. But even if it doesn't, I've noticed that a story, although a story can also be controlling, so you have to be careful of that. Here's my bias in terms of the rest of. Let me see if I can. There's one more thing I'm going to get to the end here. I'm really coming to the end. We're not going to go to 8:30 unless you guys have a million questions. I want to say something about first circle preaching, because this did happen to me fairly consistently. Many of you, I imagine, you preach the same sermon more than once on a Sunday, right? 8 o'clock and another. I had 8, 9, and 11. And 8 o'clock was intimate. It was 12, 15 people in a chapel. So it was very conversational. So it was quiet, but I could be present because I was looking at each person. 9 o'clock was our sort of boisterous family, lots of energy. So the energy of the room provided a lot. It was a little bit more animated. And then 11, in that same big room with a much smaller, sedate community. And I found myself preaching to the energy in the room, right? Which was first circle energy, right? And so I'd get really quiet. And finally someone said to me, and this is a friend at that service, and she said, "You don't sound like you're here." And I realized that in that space, I had to amp it up a bit to compensate for I had to bring more energy into that space. Whereas at 9 o'clock, I just had to kind of absorb it. Thank you, that's the word. Where at 11, I actually had to, and my tendency was to match it, which brought me inward. I don't know if that makes sense, but I wanted to say that because sometimes now what I do, because I'm in a different church every Sunday, the first thing I suss out is the joy quotient in the room. And you can feel it the minute you walk in. And in a lot of places, I realize I got to bring some joy because there's not a lot in the room, right? In other places, I can celebrate it and give thanks for it. But part of our job is to assess the tone. Or if you're preaching every Sunday in the same place, to establish a tone. It's, I think, the thing that we do most in preaching and in presiding is set a tone. I think it was Maya Angelou who said that they don't remember what you say so much as how they felt when you said it. I think they do remember some of what we say. I just think. But the feel, right? And that's second circle energy. And what I've learned is that, Andy Stanley said this, the sermon begins in the parking lot or in the hall, in the doorway. So if you wait until the sermon to welcome people or the announcements to welcome people, you've missed a lot of opportunity to help people feel at ease and to know that you're glad they're there and that you see them. Okay, that's my bias. But I think if you wait until the peace to welcome new people, you have no control over how they've experienced the first half of the liturgy. You've lost all control. It might be a completely wonderful experience. It could be the most lonely experience they've ever had, but you have abdicated your role in helping them feel at home. So what do you do, and how do you help your leaders set a tone so that whoever walks in the door, whether they've been there for 30 years or for 30 seconds, they know that they're at home, right? If you've been in a 12-step group, what's the first thing that gets said, right? Hi, I'm Mariann. I'm an alcoholic. We're going to read the 12 steps, right? Level the playing field. And so whatever we can do before we get in the pulpit to create a space where we can be heard with less anxiety. Someone, who was it? I forget. You came down and said to me, there's a lot of love in the room tonight for you, right? Do you know how nice that was to hear? It just allowed me, I'm gonna pretend as if that's true. And I'm gonna walk in and assume that I'm among friends and fellow practitioners, and we're having a conversation about what we really care about. It's a very different feeling than having to live up to the expectation of what Mark said about me before I started to talk, right? As kind as it was. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like, so setting a tone and carrying that through. And then the second, and the last thing I'll say in terms of the actual preaching piece, and this is where I have struggled the most as a preacher, and I still do, and I work at this. And I'll ask you tomorrow if you think if I succeeded, is I tend to have really weak endings. I give a lot to the process of the sermon, and I know that there are pieces in it that I think are of value, but I have a hard time kind of answering the so now what question, right? So now what? What am I wanting? How explicit can I be about what I'm hoping people will take away, or what they could do, or a way of going about their week, right? And being really intentional about that so that your sermon has a hook to it that stays with people and actually allows them to continue that spiritual conversation with God after you're done, right? And so for me, it's a growing edge. And I try, even if it's kind of lame, I try to think of something just to sort of say, okay, because of all that we've been through together, think of this, or consider this, or perhaps try this, or as you're going about your week, you know? And then a final word about, technology and the fact that a lot of our sermons live on after we're done preaching them. Sometimes intentionally, we record them, we video them, we post them. I think all of that's great. Just make sure you want it up there, right? And that it's in the form that you think is worthy of that. And I don't know about you, but I need another set of ears and another set of eyes before I am comfortable having something go up, if I can control it. Sometimes I can't. But it's important because more and more people are getting their spiritual sustenance on their own time, in their own ways, in whatever resources are available to them through social media and the internet. And we want to be there. We absolutely want to be there. You shouldn't save your best work for the people who show up just on Sunday. It should be available to others in a way that they can digest. And it takes investing in technology. It takes practice. It's a growing edge for a lot of mainline churches. We don't like screens and technology, most of our churches don't, but it's really worth thinking about because that's where more and more people at least will start. And most people aren't in church every Sunday anymore. So if you want them to stay connected, you want to give them things that can meet them where they are. It's another way of being present, fully present in the moment. So, questions, comments? Yes, in the back. And then you next.
I just wanted to make a comment about what you just said. I preach at St. Matthew's in Sterling, and they videotape and live stream all of their services and have people watching all over. And frequently people will watch for months before even walking in the door.
Right.
But I was preaching there 2 Sundays ago, and this woman walked up to me before the 11. They have an 8, 9:30, and 11. She walked up to me before the 11. She said, "My daughter just called me. She's an emergency worker, and she was watching the live stream of your sermon at the 9:30, and she called me in tears, and she said, 'You have to go to church, and you have to hear this sermon because it was for me.'" And I am very anti-screens, traditional, like uncomfortable with being recorded, never watch myself or listen to myself. But it mattered to that person.
Yeah.
So I sort of came around last week.
Yeah, what a powerful example. And it's quite possible that she will go back to that sermon and she'll share it with someone, right? We just don't know. And I think becoming comfortable with that will really help. Barbara, yes?
Yeah, I just had a question.
Microphone is coming. Just a second. I know, but
it's on. On? Is it on? Okay. What came to my mind when you were talking about that congregation, the 11 o'clock congregation being in third circle. First circle,
Right.
sorry, yeah, first circle, and that you had to preach differently because you found you were in first circle. When you started preaching in second circle, did they come into second circle with you?
I don't know. It was the hardest sermon. It was the hardest congregation to gauge. I actually stopped trusting completely my sense of how the congregation receives. I love the feeling that some of you described when you can just hear a pin drop. Love that. But it's not always the case that when that doesn't happen, that the congregation isn't being moved. And so I couldn't tell. But what I did know is that it changed me and my engagement, and I felt like I was showing up more. And to be honest, I was tired too. It was the third of 3, it was a long morning. But it was like saying, save some energy, girl, because they deserve it as much as anybody, right? Thank you for that. Other questions or comments? In the back? Here comes Anne.
When I'm taping a sermon, when I know it's maybe going to go up online, it makes me more anxious.
Yeah.
And I find myself not being, as you've described it, in second circle. And I just want to put it out there that sometimes I find the technology gets in the way, and I'll decide not to record something. And then often people say, "Did you record that this morning?" I'll say, "No, I didn't," because I didn't think it was going to be very good, or whatever the reason is. And so sometimes I just simply want to be in the room.
Sure.
And not have to be worried about how it's going to be heard online. But that may be a generational thing. I don't know. But I just wonder whether anybody has any tips for staying in second circle in the midst of the technology and knowing.
Sounds like someone might over here.
I think the only tip that I could say is do it all the time. It's like when we started preaching, who am I to get up in front of these people and tell them anything about God? Yeah, I've got the thing on the wall, but seriously. But the more you do it, the better you get. So do it all the time. And before you know it, it becomes invisible to you, and you are present with the people there. So don't wait for special occasions. Do it every Sunday.
I also like recording more than one version of the sermon, because then I can hit a delete button. And I did something for the first time this year. I actually put the sermons in the Way of Love series on a podcast. And my original intent was to have them live, right? Live sermons. Could never do it. First of all, I was never finished I had never felt finished enough by Sunday to feel like it was worthy of a podcast. And second, the technology always failed me, or I didn't show up in a way that I felt comfortable. So I wound up re-recording every one because I wanted it to be that. But I think if you preach more than once on a Sunday and you can listen and say, this is the one that I would take up, and the other two just... Okay, I want to leave you with just where I began, which is a word of encouragement and a reminder that I do believe in the loaves and the fish. I do believe that God loves us and wants us to be fruitful in the pulpit, as much for our sake as for those who hear us, because it's such a great feeling of that divine human partnership that we all long for in all aspects of our life. And so to trust that, and to trust that God is going to meet you and me and the people who listen more than halfway, which doesn't excuse mediocre sermons. That's not what I'm saying. But it does say that we've got a little bit of grace in this, right? So I'm going to end by reading again the passage from Paul to the Society of Clay Jars. Therefore, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart. We have renounced the shameful things that one hides. We refuse to practice cunning or to falsify God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we commend ourselves to the conscience of everyone in the sight of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. Isn't that good news? May it be so. God bless you all. Have a wonderful week. Thank you.
I'm not sure about you, but I've been immensely blessed by our time today. I've grown spiritually, I've grown as a preacher, but more importantly, I've grown as a person. And out of the wholeness of our personhood, we're able to preach whole sermons. And so thank you for bringing that to us today.